Welcome to Science Conversations. I'm Kaysie Vokurka. What was Darwin's theory of evolution really about? Joining me to discuss this topic is Dr. John Ashton. Welcome, Dr. John.
Hello, Kaysie.
Glad to have you with us again. We will be looking at the second part from Chapter 2 of this book on Evolution Impossible, which Dr. John Ashton has wrote. And we're going to have a look at some more details from that. So we've been talking about how Darwin came up with his theory of evolution. And obviously, since he came up with that theory, there's been a lot of evidence that's been collected that's helping to support that theory. What kind of evidence have biologists gathered for the evolutionary tree of life, which Darwin used as the basis for his theory to begin with?
Right. Yeah, so the theory of evolution really opened up the opportunity for particularly atheists to challenge the biblical worldview. And so there were a number of people that were very interested in certainly following up on this evidence. Yes. And I guess when we look at the situation today in our schools and colleges, there seems to be this underpinning philosophy or worldview that we want to keep God out of the classroom. So over the years there's been a lot of research that has been done in an attempt to support Darwin's theory. And I guess firstly this has come from the fossil record. So essentially if we, Darwin's idea looked at initially there was some primitive life form in which life first started, and of course no one knows what that was, but then this essentially became some sort of universal common ancestor. And then from this universal common ancestor, we have sort of single-celled organisms, such as bacteria forming, and then simple single-cell organisms with a nucleus. And then these evolved into, things like, some of the plants, into things like worms, and then, up the scale into fish, amphibians, and then into reptiles and mammals and so forth. And so this, as we look in the fossil record, it seems to be, of course, that we find mammals, high up in the record, this sort of thing, as opposed to low down, and primitive organisms, bacteria and this sort of thing in the lower layers. And so this led to, so there was a geological evidence that seemed to support it. But also, of course, when they looked at the similarities, so the structure in sort of fish with backbones and this sort of thing, this backbone structure carried on through a number of species. So what they did was they looked, for example, animals that had, say, 4 legs. We have, arms and legs, these sort of things. Similar structures can be found in dolphins and whales and these sort of things. So these similarities, this was sort of a homologous look, comparing the physical structure. So they developed a tree of life based on that. But it's been quite fascinating that in recent times, as we've begun measuring the DNA, which we know underpins how proteins are assembled as an organism develops. It encodes the way in which the proteins have been assembled to form the new creature. So when we look at when we look at the DNA similarities, we actually come up with a very different tree. And that is a phylogenetic tree. And so that's very different to what we would expect if we looked at the physical similarities. And so this again should ring alarm bells with regard to Darwin's original theory. And that's why, again, if we look at the DNA, we get a very, very different picture. For example, if we look at human DNA, we've got E. coli DNA, we've got DNA from mushrooms, we've got DNA from dogs, this sort of thing.
Which you wouldn't think is very related.
Yeah. Well, that's right. So it's sort of very, it's quite fascinating. So it's led to, very different pictures now. And so biologists are still trying to work out now a consistent phylogenetic tree that really works. And there are major problems in that area, my understanding is, because the DNA patterns are so diverse and unexpected.
So what I hear you saying then is initially in this process of looking for evidence, the fossil records seem to give quite consistent evidence with the theory, and that by looking at the physiological, the skeletal sort of similarities between species, it could be seen generally a trend of development from the, if you will, lower organisms through to the more complex, larger species, as it's sort of played out in the fossil record. And then keep going a few more decades and we find the genetics coming into it, and then suddenly it doesn't seem to be that simple in terms of how this evolutionary process would have come about, because at the fundamental level of the code of how everything has, how everything works from the biological perspective, it's really complicated.
Well, it's complicated, but the fascinating thing is it's very different.
Okay, yes.
It's a totally different tree. So the tree of life that you would draw looking at the physical similarities of animals and how you would expect it to evolve on the basis of physical similarities is very different to the tree of life that we draw if we base it on the DNA genetic code. And this is where the challenge is. Wow, it just doesn't seem to fit that original pattern which was in everybody's mind. If Darwin's theory explains how we came here, you'd expect it to be consistent on the basis of, as Richard Dawkins talks about, you've got a fish, in a pond, the ponds are drying up, so the fish that develop sort of leg-like structures are able to crawl to the next pond and survive. Right? So this is based on a physical similarity, but when we look at the DNA, well, hang on, no, there's a very different jump. So the phylogenetic similarity doesn't fit that logical survival of the fittest scenario that we would expect. And this is a fascinating challenge for biology there. And so it's one of the questions I think that raises a red light for us with regard to this whole theory of evolution.
So today, in terms of how people approach the whole evolutionary process, and the tree of life, do they base it more strongly on the genetics these days with the phylogenetic trees, or more on the fossil record, similarities model, or do they try and combine it? What is the main approach
I think the
these
phylogenetic approach is very new, and it's mainly discussed in high-level research papers. So really, from the point of view of teaching, and having an illustration that people can understand, it's still really based on similarities. And one of the sad things about this, for example, is I was visiting a dinosaur museum, and they had a book on display, Grandmother Fish.
Oh, okay.
And so, again, they're, trying to get through to children. Again, these picture books, but again, it's all on the basis of these physical similarities. But again, as we're learning from the genetics, that doesn't follow necessarily.
Very fascinating to just see how that has all been investigated and playing out. And we're going to continue to examine this question, what was Darwin's theory of evolution really about? So be sure to join us.